All right, here's all the key reasons why you're not going to build muscle or you're not building muscle now. You guys ready?
Ready.
I'm so ready.
Yeah, ready, set, go. So we talk about building muscle a lot, and we talk about all different types of training variables and formats and goals that people might have. And I think sometimes it can sound like it's getting a little convoluted. And I think there's a lot of confusion that lies around muscle building, strength training, endurance, muscular endurance versus like cardiovascular endurance and how to balance it all. We've done several episodes and had several conversations about how to balance certain things. But in this one, I want to keep it focused to building muscle, hypertrophy. And more specifically, why you're not getting the result that you're looking for, or why you're not going to get the result you're looking for if you're doing certain things or not doing other things. So I just want to kind of break down a few principles here and then give some people maybe some tips or some strategies to maybe change things up and not completely turn their workout on their head, but think about things a little bit differently. And really, these are basic things that it's become apparent to me in some conversations I've had lately that people need to be reminded about. So I thought we jump back into it. I think we're at the beginning of 2025. People are thinking about their workout programs as per usual, a little bit harder and a little bit more, and they're kind of reevaluating their goals or reevaluating successes or failures that they had or didn't have, previously. It's just kind of that they're in that mindset right now. So this might be a good place to kind of hit them with a few things to just re-examine and kind of get into. So one of the things that drives me nuts, I think, around the hypertrophy thing is, or building muscle, is a lot of times it gets boiled down too simply. And people, talk about this is how you get success. And it's through like things like this particular exercise, right? Or this particular workout program or whatever. And yes, there are workout programs and there are exercises within those workout programs. It's never about what's in the program, it's how it's applied. And so what we're really talking about is like application. And people all have all different goals. And I want to be clear about this. If you're building hypertrophy, then you're likely building strength, right? And if you're building strength, you're likely going to build some level of hypertrophy until you don't. And that is based on the application of what you're doing. And so in kind of high leveling this and breaking it down, like I think there are three key principles that you need to understand about this. So people go, yeah, I've heard that before. But do you know how to apply them is where I want to go with this. So yes, I've heard this before. And, people have talked about that. Oh, we're not inventing anything new. We're not going to give people a science lesson. But there are really three key things that you have to understand and apply in order to build muscle. And there's a lot of nuance and detail that can go into all of that. I'm going to try to not to go into all of that. Like maybe we've gone a little deeper in the past, but there's a few things people want to know or should know if you're in the gym, so that you're not wasting your time and you're actually getting the result that you're looking for. You guys ready?
Ready.
Yeah. All right. So principally, there's when we're talking about muscle hypertrophy, let's talk about muscles and kind of how they work. In order to elicit a growth in muscle tissue, there's kind of three things you need to keep in mind here. First off is tension, mechanical tension. So how do you apply mechanical tension? Well, that's why you go to the gym, because we got we got the barbells and the dumbbells and the cables and tubing and apparatus that you can hang from and pull on and push on and leg press on and all that kind of stuff. Yes, those things that you can apply force to will create tension. But the oversimplification is when people look at that and go, yeah, I just need to use more weight, right? Or I just need to use weight or load, right? Which we'll get into in a second here. But they think that like if I want to grow more muscle, I have to use more weight. That's not what I'm talking about here. We're talking about tension.
I love, there's a quote that, I don't know who said it, but of muscles don't know load, they know tension, they know mechanical tension. And so like even comparing exercises, people will want to compare loads of a varying exercise when really like it's a lot more in the nuance of like playing with lever arms, playing with the tension, playing with your application of that tension, if it's through the right tissue, all that different stuff, not just are you adding more weight every week. That's not necessarily the basic principle of it. So
it's the intention as well as far as how you're going through certain movement patterns with those loads.
Yes, the intention of the tension. Love it. Yeah.
So the first thing is creating that mechanical tension. There's many ways to do that, and it goes beyond load. But one of the things that you need to understand when you're creating tension and however you're doing it is load management while you're creating that tension. And we'll get into some detail here of what elicits what we know, basically through science and experience, and whether it's anecdotal or proven on, in studies or in a laboratory, so to speak. Like load management is very important here. And so, yes, you need to use enough weight in order to elicit that response that you're looking for, which again, is muscle growth in this case, right? Which will, if you're doing that, you're also going to be building strength, right? But how you apply that, and there are some specifics here in terms of how much weight you need to use within that tension in order to create this. So I just want to be clear about load management. The load management is much more than just about adding more weight to the bar or adding, grabbing that heavier set of dumbbells. So that's the second thing, is the load management. And then the third thing is the recovery from the work that you're actually putting in. Now, and if your goal is muscle hypertrophy, or then managing those things and with regard to the loads and the tension that you're putting on, that's where things actually get a little bit more detailed in terms of what your body needs in order to recover from the stimulus that you're giving it, in order so that it can basically recover beyond where you started with it. So that could mean from workout to workout, from week to week, from month to month, from year to year, however you want to look at it. And there's a lot of things that go into that, but those are your three key principles. Again, so it's mechanical tension, it's load management, and it's the recovery process, or the management of that recovery. And again, people are like, yeah, I've heard this before. I know this. Yeah, but are you doing that? So I open this up with, here's the reasons why you're not building muscle, or you're not going to build muscle. And they're all going to be rooted. Any lack of success that you're having are rooted in one of those three things, or all of those things, depending on kind of where you're coming into this. So just going back to the mechanical tension piece, like again, like people choose exercises to create tension. And there's a lot of emotion and things that are attached to a lot of exercises to create that tension. And I think that's where we start with, which is like, what are you choosing to create this tension as it relates to also managing those other two principles that we are trying not to violate here? You can't. And well, if you do, then you're not going to build the muscle that you want. So, and there could be some other deeper rooted things there, but we're not going to get into that too deep into that today. But when we're looking at that mechanical tension, you just mentioned it, muscles don't know loads, they know tension, right? So that sounds like semantics. What do you mean by that?
So, I mean, here's a really good example of when you change, and knowing biomechanics and lever arms and moment arms and how those things vary based on where you're loading a movement, and based on even the movement where the load is in space in that current range of motion of the movement too. So a good example is doing like an exercise like a good morning versus like a stiff leg deadlift, right? Where people a lot of times will want to correlate loads of the stiff leg deadlift, right? Or a Romanian deadlift, and then they apply that to their good morning, when really you could be doing a great deal less literal weight on the good morning, but because it is a longer lever arm to your hamstrings, you could get just an effective stimulus on your hamstrings with a lighter load. So that's an example of like how you're manipulating these things, how you're manipulating your leverages. And that goes a lot into like technique as well. Another good example is like someone doing like a bicep curl. A really common compensation in a bicep curl is when they're trying to pull into flexion, when they're trying to pull the dumbbell from point A to point B, a lot of people will dip their elbow back and they'll shorten that moment arm when they're pulling. And even though that could be a heavier load you did than last week you did the 20s with the elbow in a good position where you're keeping that long arm. If you shorten that, even though you now are doing the 30s, you're not getting an over stimulus there. You're getting either a net neutral stimulus or might be a net negative stimulus, even though that weight is heavier than it was last week.
So you've sacrificed mechanical tension for loading.
Exactly.
Right? And that's, I think it's probably one of the largest mistakes you see a lot of people making. And it's
100%.
That it's not that sacrificing that in that way can't make you stronger, right? And or won't give you some level of increase in hypertrophy or muscle growth.
Yeah.
but the efficiency there is obviously compromised.
Mhm.
And if the goal is to build muscle, that principle that you just mentioned is uber important.
Yes.
You cannot sacrifice, you do not want to sacrifice the tension that you're trying to apply through the muscle or muscles that you're training for load and expect the best hypertrophy result.
Yep.
The other thing that what in the exercises that you just described there is we started to move into more isolated movements,
Yep.
which is another big thing. So when we look at like load management and what you're trying to do in terms of creating hypertrophy, the more things that you add to that equation, and what I mean by that is like more joints and more muscles, then you have to understand that you're going to take away from a very specific effect that you might be trying to get in a very specific area.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what you were kind of describing with both of those movements. So as an example, like I might be very strong in my deadlift, right? But that doesn't mean I'm going to grow or I'm going to increase the size of my biceps.
Yeah.
All right. Now people would go like, of course not. Well, in reality though, your biceps are working fairly hard, right? In a heavily loaded deadlift, but you are not isolating any specific area there. So you shouldn't expect to get any specific hypertrophy result there. It's not to say that like a newbie coming in that only did deadlifts does not get extra bicep girth in the starting out. I don't want to get lost in the weeds here, but my point is like people are like, yeah, man, that makes perfect sense. Okay. So then going back to like your bicep thing or your bicep example, then they move over to something like a bicep curl and they think they need to be moving that load the same way with the same intensity or the same type of, I'll just use, I think intensity is the right word. They need to be moving that bicep curl the same way and they should feel the same as when they're moving the deadlift or the barbell from the floor to their hips.
Yeah.
This is where things get very, very lost. Right? Like, no, it doesn't need to be like, what we need to do is create tension through the entire range of motion that elicits the response that we're looking to achieve here. So I think people get really confused with like, oh, well, if I'm lifting super heavy here, somehow I should equate, like I have to lift super heavy over here. No, this goes back to the tension principle.
Yeah.
How much tension can I build and maintain through that range of motion for this particular exercise for this particular muscle group that I'm trying to, again, grow or get gains through. So tension and load are two totally different things.
Yeah.
And I think that's the point we're trying to make here. So then when you move into the load management piece, like what are some of the reasons you're not building muscle in the areas, right, that you are trying to build muscle in? Well, it's likely because you're not managing the things we just talked about. And more specifically, what I'm saying is like, how much weight are you trying to use to build this muscle? And we know basically through science, again, what's happened in a laboratory and what obviously happens when you look at people as they're training, like certain loads do not build muscle hypertrophy, right, after a certain point. Right? Like I guess I would break it down to this. Are you training for strength or are you training for hypertrophy? Because those are two different things.
Yeah.
And again, I already related, like if you're building hypertrophy, if you're increasing your hypertrophy, you're probably increasing your strength as well. But just because you're increasing your strength doesn't necessarily mean you're increasing your hypertrophy. And my point of this is to your bicep curl. Just because I can put more load in my hand, right, and get that dumbbell, from point A to point B.
Yeah.
It matters much more how you did it than how much load you have in your hand.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm getting too far off the rails here, but does that make sense?
Well, yeah, and it does. I think it's important to, with load management, really what that means, it's not, it's the literal load, managing that load, but it's also the load management of like your total training volume and how many repetitions you're getting with that load.
That's where I was going.
Right.
Yep.
So how many sets, how many reps, what is that volume? And then I think, we're going to kind of dive into this more of, is that the appropriate load for the amount of volume that you're dictating or that you're implementing with that load? So when you're saying, for example, that you there's kind of a limiting point, there's a point of diminishing returns, or there's a point where you're going to not maximize muscle hypertrophy when you're going so hard through the load, where you can't get a repeatability of volume. Right? You can't manage that load. That there is yes, we need a lot of mechanical tension. That's one of the main drivers, but you need repeated bouts of mechanical tension to maximize muscle hypertrophy. So if you're only going in there and you're doing a 3x1, and that could be a crazy amount of mechanical tension that you're generating, even if you have great technique, great intention, great movement, all of that. But if you're not getting enough repeated bouts with that mechanical tension, you're going to be leaving things on the table.
Correct. So
and there's something to be said though, as well, as far as making sure that the mechanical tension is appropriate, in that you're not doing 15 to 20 to 25 repetitions as well.
Yeah.
So let's break that down a little bit. So like here's what I would say, like if strength training, so if you're training for maximal strength, we're probably working somewhere in the rep ranges of 1 to 5 of somewhere above like your 85% of your 1 rep maximum, right? So obviously if
You mean
that
85% of your 1 rep max,
What did I
not
say?
above.
What did I
You
say?
said above your 1 rep
No,
max.
sorry.
Of
Your
yeah,
1
yeah,
rep max.
yeah.
Sorry, not 85% above. You'd be a freaking
Yeah.
you'd be an
And
animal.
that wasn't your 1 rep.
So let me say it again. So 1 to 5 repetitions of 85% of your 1 rep maximum, right? And so what that's doing is that's creating a high amount of tension. But what you're saying is it doesn't create enough time in that tension to elicit the response that we're trying to get from a muscle growth perspective.
Yes, correct.
So then we need to look, and one of the things you said that we were talking about in terms of sacrificing things is this: when you're trying to build muscle, how you're doing that repetition and how you're applying that tension is critical, right? It's the same for strength in terms of if you want to keep building it or not. But again, applying that through that range of motion where you have that tension through the entire range of motion, or you're maximizing that tension through that entire range of motion for a period of time is what's really important. So you should be looking at this as, okay, so what would I be doing then if 1 to 5 at 85% of my 1 rep max is not good? Let's look at like a 6 to 12 repetition scheme where now I have more time under that. Well, I wouldn't be able to handle my 85% at that point. So it should be less than that. Well, how much less? Probably somewhere between 60, 65 and that below that 85 is what we need to do. So that's when we start looking at volume, right? So intensity is still there. It's just there over a longer period of time. And that's where people need to get their heads around. It's like you're going and you're doing, your 3 rep max on your bench press and you're not getting any bigger. You're not putting any size on. Well, it's because you don't have enough time under that. So what should you do? Well, then I'll just do another 3 rep max later in the week. I'll do another workout and hit my 3 rep max of my bench press later in the week. Well, then that falls into our basically our recovery piece.
Yes. Yeah.
Because if you're applying that much load and that intensity under that time duration, right, then you're going to need more time to recover, right, in order to recover back to baseline, in order to increase more strength or ultimately more load on that bar. But you haven't created enough time under that tension in order to really elicit the hypertrophy response.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note, because some people might bring up that there has been more recent studies on the ability to build muscle at lower rep ranges or higher rep ranges, and though the in a controlled laboratory that those things may be showing, I still think it's exactly what you're just alluding to with the recovery piece. Of yes, there might be a response to be able to build muscle with a lower rep range, or there might be a response to build muscle with a very high rep range that she mentioned. But I think when you work in that really low rep range, if you are really actually working with a percent of your 1 rep max that is stimulating enough to get muscle growth, to get in any repeated bouts, it's going to be so much put you in recovery debt on even from a central nervous system aspect, that to get that, it's almost impossible, I think, to get that for a long duration of time. So it's like where you said you can build some muscle in those low rep ranges, but at a certain point, you're going to reach a point of diminishing returns on your recovery, because that's a really huge point for this. And then just to touch really quickly on the high rep range, I think because there's so many bouts of there, that's a lot of time under tension, but to pick a load that is stimulating enough in that high rep range, that is stimulating enough to create the mechanical tension that you need to build muscle, but that you can also get adequate volume, but that you can also recover for. I think that just adds way too many variables that you can miss the target.
Agreed.
Where that's where I love, like, even though there's data showing this, but how do you extrapolate from the data of things that have been used for a long time of the 6 to 12 range for hypertrophy? We've talked about this, but why I think that is still a really, really good goal and range is because it's a sweet spot where you can load it heavy enough to get a good response for mechanical tension, which again, we already defined that load doesn't necessarily equal mechanical tension, but it is a component of it. But you can also get enough volume and enough time with that tension to create enough bouts of a stimulus to build muscle. So
yeah, so there's a thing we didn't add in here with regard to the load management and the tension piece, and that basically is the muscle damage that happens during that time, right? And damage is a
micro trauma.
Yeah, again, that word gets used, and I guess in reality, that's kind of what's happening. There's a breakdown that's happening of tissue and things that are happening at a cellular level that your body has to respond to. That goes back into the recovery piece, but you mentioned things like the central nervous system and the stresses that it's putting on that, and you also mentioned like 1 to 5. We mentioned 1 to 5 versus 6 to 12. Well, if you only did 5 repetitions, but you did those at a tempo that would keep you under tension, right, for the same amount of time that the 6 to 12 would be, well, then we're talking the same thing, right? It's the time that you're spending under that tension. So you mentioned like the sweet spot, and that's what. It's not that the 6 to 12 is a perfect number. It just gives us the time with a load that's manageable in order to get that time or get the tension over that time done in, which also leaves enough gas in the tank to then be able to apply that maybe multiple times over multiple sets in a single session or over multiple sessions during the week. So again, just hanging into the load management piece, like, okay, so I'm working at an intense level and I'm doing my 3 to 4 sets of 6 to 12 or whatever it is of this particular thing. Well, if I'm increasing my intensity or if I'm trying to manage that intensity over time, one of the things that working in that 6 to 12 repetition range, and again, managing the tension through the tempos, is it allows you to then hit that multiple times during the week, right? In terms of the frequency piece, it allows you to hit it more frequently and still get a recoverability that allows you to basically reap the rewards of the work that you did.
Yes. Yeah.
So again, like if you're training for strength and you've been training for strength and we're hitting these low rep ranges, high intensity, you're probably going to stop building muscle at some point. Now, again, depending on where you are in your journey, you know, what your training age is like, what you're doing on the recovery piece, which we haven't talked about, like it's going to be different for different people. But if you're looking to build muscle, right, and build muscle over a long period of time, that's the other great part about understanding these principles is I can continue to do that over a very long period of time with a return on that investment versus continually training at those high intensity levels that are predominantly going to build strength over the muscle building.
Yeah.
So then that brings into the third part, which is the recoverability piece. Like, what are we doing in order to recover? And what do we mean when we say recovery when it comes to muscle building versus, in this case, we're talking about, like, I'm comparing and contrasting this against the strength training, which is I see a lot of people doing. Again, like I think I used the example at the beginning of the 5x5 routine. The 5x5 routine is good and you can build muscle and strength by doing this for sure. It's an awesome way to format your workouts. And one of the things you're doing is you're hitting the things multiple times per week. So, but you're also giving yourself much time in between in order to recover that. So like whether it's a Monday, Wednesday, Friday routine or a Monday, Thursday, Saturday or something, I've got lots of time in between. But if you're a person that likes to go or wants to build muscle and you like to go to the gym 6 days a week, that's not going to be the right routine for you because you're not giving yourself the recovery that you need in order to, again, recover back to baseline and then build on top of that. So if we're looking at this sort of in kind of the specific on the recovery side of things, I think you look at, okay, so tension, load management, right? Recovery. How do you set that up really well for muscle building through the week? And the old body split routine works really well here. And on the hypertrophy side of things, if you're breaking that up to where you're hitting the same body part or the same muscles 2 times a week, or sometimes even more than that, depending on, again, what the intensity is like or what the specificity of your exercise selection has been like, you can get a really great result from that over a long period of time. Just look at the bodybuilders. That's what they're doing constantly. They're never really working into, specific strength or power phases.
Yeah.
They're applying the same principles consistently over and over and over again. And they're not using maximal loads. They're using submaximal loads. They're working and they're working through tempos that create that tension over time. And it's not that they're not strong. These guys are fucking strong, right? The bigger, more seasoned, especially when you're looking at bodybuilding versus like physique. I'm not saying physique guys aren't strong or physique people aren't strong. If you look at them over time, they are strong people, right? But they are not getting in there to find out what their 1 rep max is on a regular basis. They're managing like what, again, is that 65 to 85%. So if I'm doing that 6 to 12 repetitions, I'm doing maybe 10 and leaving 2 in the tank. I'm never really fully going to maximal failure on every single set. Why? Because I've given my body enough tension and load over time in order for it to respond appropriately, recover appropriately, which leaves me room to go back and hit it again. So again, if you're not building the muscle, if you're not building muscle, you should be looking at like, what am I doing with my rep and set schemes as it relates to my loads? Am I providing enough stimulus? Am I providing too much stimulus? And how would you know that? Well, it goes back to those percentages.
So, and I think too, that's a good thing you pointed out as far as the person who likes to go to the gym, 5-6 days a week versus the person who maybe can't get in there that often. So I think that's where you also really need to analyze like what's a realistic routine for you to maintain. And we've talked about consistency and all that. But if you are someone who's going to go 6 days a week and you're pushing to too high of an intensity, right? And you're doing muscle groups where you're going to hit them multiple times per week, you really need to make sure you're load managing the intensity, the load that goes with that, which, is a lot tied to intensity, the mechanical tension as far as like the time under tension. Like if you're doing really long tempos, really long eccentrics, like those things take a long time to recover for. So that person, it might be more about getting a lot of training volume in if you do enjoy training often so that you can recover from. But on the other side of things, if you're someone who can really only train like twice a week, like ramping up the intensity portion of that, ramping up that you have a 3 to 4 days in between each thing to each body part to recover from it, like ramping up the amount of intensity, but also the time under tension and all those other aspects and getting more proximity to failure, that might be the way you want to go too. So that's also another thing to consider, like which person are you and are you actually implementing the direction that you probably should be for what your routine looks like. So
yeah, I think so. Again, breaking it down, like I'm glad you brought that up. Like, look, I'm not going to the gym 5 to 6 days a week. I just don't have time to do that. Okay, well then manage the tempos and the time under tension in the 3 days a week that you have appropriately. But it doesn't mean going again. You need to look at like how many repetitions am I actually doing? How much volume of work am I actually doing? And so I think a lot of people sacrifice the intensity piece. They go straight to that. Like, I got to be lifting more weight. And then what you see is the rep schemes, they start to drop down. And as that happens, then what you've done is you've taken volume out of the workout. So you've sacrificed volume for intensity. And so there's a balance there. Yeah. And if you've been in that same routine where it's just been like, I know what I know what I can get 5 out of, and I'm working more like the 5 to 8, and I'm not getting the hypertrophy gains, well, then back that off a little bit. Yeah. Like take a little weight off the bar, push more towards the 10 repetition to 12 repetition area. It won't take you more time, right? Like in reality, you are spending more time under tension, but your recovery periods between sets and likely, they're going to probably be about the same. So if we're resting again, like if you're in that 1 to 5 routine, then you're probably resting somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to maybe as much as 5 minutes, right? To recover in order to be able to get your 5 again, right? But if you're bumping it up, like again, with regard to volume and dropping off your intensity a little bit, you won't need as much time to recover, right? And you can still push the same amount of load and get that same time under that mechanical tension at a load that will elicit the response that you're trying to get in basically the same amount of time. So you're taking rest times, you're decreasing rest times, and you're increasing the volume of work that you're actually doing. And that might feel weird. Like the weight that you have on the bar, the weight that you have in your hands is going to be a little bit less, but you should be able to get back under that bar, over that bar, or that weight in your hands a little quicker than you were before.
So I think with the recovery piece, there's kind of 2 aspects of it. There's what's your programming like? What's the other 2 factors we talked about? What does your time in the gym look like? So those are like the inputs for growth. But then on the back end of the recovery, like it's all the other things we've talked about. We talk about all the time, like what's your sleep like? What's your, what's your nutrition? What's your daily movement like? Those are all the other things that you need to be managing. Like if you feel you're in the gym stuff is great and you're still not making gains, like you reached the first 2 metrics we talked about and then the first half of the recovery, then what does that back half look like? What are those later inputs look like?
I would say it's more than half.
Yeah.
Actually, if I had to break it down, I mean,
For sure.
Stevie would probably agree with this too.
Yeah.
As far as the recovery component?
Yeah.
What, as far as
like the importance of recovery?
And the things that go into that if you're trying to build muscle.
Yeah, I mean, it's you got to eat enough and you got to sleep enough. I mean, that's
the basic principles.
Yeah,
I know it sounds simple, but those are basic principles that are constantly violated.
Yeah,
right, and that is like, first off, if you're not building muscle, it's and you are managing your volume and intensity in the ways that we've talked about, then the first thing I'd be looking at is, are you even eating enough calories? Do you have enough fuel to recover from the work that you're doing? And by and large, most of the time, we find that most people are not. They're simply not eating enough.
Yeah.
Right. So they're not getting enough energy in the system. And then when you start to look at what that energy consists of, like the next thing is like, what are you doing to balance your macronutrients? We just did another podcast specific to, what people will do drastically, going with an expectation of results, fat loss, muscle building or whatever, going into like the first of the year. And they go right into calorie restriction or just restriction period. We kind of covered it high level, but calorie restriction is usually part of that, or increasing calorie expenditure through things like cardio, right? Well, if you're doing that, then you're undernourished. If you're again trying to build muscle and or strength for that matter.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you're not fueling enough, like you'll feel it. I think a lot of people can slog through their workouts, but if you really are trying to ramp up these other things we were talking about, after a little bit, you're going to notice that you're just not recovering. And either you're going to just notice that in a reduction in performance, feeling like shit all the time, feeling sore, or
you're not building muscle,
or that might oftentimes leads to injury, I think, too, as well. So, but I mean, huge, I think, is for sleeping. I think people who want to push and do these things, sleep is one of the first things that gets put on the back burner and it's just caffeinated away. So managing, and not just the quantity of your sleep, but the quality of your sleep is huge. So.
Yeah, I think so. There's some measurables here. And again, just referring back to the other podcast, one of those things was getting your house in order. Like, do you even know, or you're, kind of where you are? Again, going back to those percentages, what does that actually mean? Do I suggest that everybody goes in and does a 1 rep max test in order to understand exactly what their 85% is? No, I don't actually suggest that at all. That's the other great part about training for hypertrophy and working through more of that 6 to 12 repetition area. Like, we're trying to get at or near 12, right? And still leave some in the tank, which means you're training submaximally. And if you're training in that 6 to 12 repetition range and you get to number 10, you're like, yeah, I might have 2. You go for another one. You're like, no, I definitely don't have 2. Guess what? You're probably training in nearly the perfect rep or load range in order to elicit the result that you're trying to get to, versus when you get into the strength training things, those things become much more specific. So I guess what I'm saying is you can be a little bit more random, and it's okay if you're training for hypertrophy and you're not managing like to these very specific percentages. So particularly as your weeks go on, your workouts change, your exercise selection changes or whatever else, you can get a pretty good gauge on how much you should be lifting, right? From a load perspective, by just managing that very, very specifically. Just like, my goal is 10 with 2 in the tank. That gets you right in the wheelhouse of the 6 to 12. So 2 in the tank is, I think I might be able to get 2. Cool, you're done. Like, you're done. Like, I might be able to get 2 more. Cool, you're done.
Yeah.
Rest, recover, 60, 90 seconds. Maybe it's as long as 2 minutes. If you're feeling a little fatigued, you didn't get as much rest, you didn't get as much fuel on board. And then you hit that again. And now you hit 9. And you're like, I definitely don't have 2 in the tank. Guess what? You're still in that 6 to 12 range, right? And you're working probably just at the right intensity. And over time, you can manage that, right? And instead of having to do a 1 rep max to understand exactly what that number is. I think a lot of people get lost in the sauce there. That is again, going back to what's happened in a laboratory, what's been measured, and then anecdotally, what we see work all the time, constantly, is people working in those rep ranges. So the other part about that, again, is I don't want to take away from like strength building isn't important, but I think people just get lost in the put more weight on, put more weight on, put more weight on. But where are they actually moving over time? And to your point, and going back to the getting your house in order, like, are you actually putting on muscle? Like, do you know? There are ways to measure that. It's simple. I mean, you can get a body comp test or whatever else, and certainly you can see things in the mirror. And I think that's where people are, will go first. Like, oh, you're getting bigger. Yeah, but for how long? Are you continuing to change in the way that you need to change? So the a couple key takeaways there is like, what is the quality of the tension that I'm putting into my body? Right.
Yep.
Am I throwing weights around, or am I really focused, if my goal is hypertrophy, on creating that tension in the biomechanically the best way I can, so that tension is from top to bottom. It's there the entire time. That's what'll tell you how much load you should be using. Right. And the next thing is like, am I hitting the rep ranges? Right. So if I'm hitting those rep ranges, I'm able to maintain those mechanics in that way, dude, you're spot on. You don't have to have somebody, you don't have to be tracking and monitoring every single thing. I think tracking is good, but you don't have to be tracking and monitoring everything. You can still just go to the gym and work out, dude. Like, you can do that. And then the other part is the recovery side of things. How much time do I need to recover in order to be able to repeat that? You said the word repeatability. And how many times can I do that during the week before I start to see things start to fall off the other end? But I just want to talk a little bit more on the recovery side. So we mentioned like just rest times in between sets based on the intensity and the loads that you're using. We talked a little bit about nutrition, and people want to go deep into the, like, am I taking the right supplements? Am I doing all the extra little things that I need to get there? If you're not building muscle and you're managing those other things right, again, what I said was up front, if you're not building muscle, you're violating one of these principles. And the recovery piece, I think, is one of the most violated principles, because people either go too long, right? They're resting too much, or they're not resting enough, or they're not recovering the right way. And a lot of components go into that. We mentioned, are you eating enough? So we talk about that ad nauseum on the show. I mean, I don't know how deep you want to go into that, but what are the key components?
If, as far as eating enough, I mean, you got to be eating at least, I would say, at maintenance and probably into a surplus. And as far as like protein consumption, you want to be getting towards that 1 to 1.2 grams per pound of body weight. It's probably a good place to be for most people. Really, to be honest, I think it's not as complicated. It's not some like complex, like I need to be on the bodybuilder diet. Not being carb phobic is part of it. I think that that could be a slippery slope for some people, as far as, being a little bit gun shy, maybe, in terms of the carbohydrate consumption and how much that can aid your performance, which is going to ultimately aid your ability to build muscle. So yeah, as far as, your percentages, that might be, 30% of your total intake from protein. That might be, 45, maybe up to 50% of your total intake from carbohydrates.
You're freaking people out, man.
And as far as the amount of, as far as the amount of, really, it's the formula is not that complicated. I think really the biggest issue is just paying attention to it. Everybody gets so enamored with their workouts and what supplements am I taking and what pre-workout am I taking.
That's my point.
Just getting away from the basic fundamentals, that really the difference versus like the bodybuilder diet versus just like regular average Joe who's just trying to stay in shape is just like a little bit more of this, a little bit less of that. It's not that
consistent.
big of it's not that big of a difference.
I think just one guy's paying more attention to it than the other guy.
Yeah.
Is what we're talking about. There's very conscious about, like, I gotta get that protein shake in after. It's not the protein shake. Like, that's part of it, right? It's not the protein shake. Like, it's the fact that he's putting calories in, and he's putting it in the form of protein to make sure he hits his protein need. He's just paying more attention to it.
Yeah, it's not a magic protein shake, or I need to increase my protein shake consumption. That's just a tool in order to get in the amount of protein that you should be consuming. It's not. Yeah, it's a facilitator. It's not the answer.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, on the recovery side, we talked about the major principles. The recovery side, I think, is probably one of the most violated principles in all of this. And you don't have to be a biomechanics expert, a nutrition expert, or whatever to get past this. Building muscle is not that hard to do. Like the formula is actually pretty simple. It's the application piece, which is what I was alluding to before, and more specifically, the overcomplication and sometimes oversimplification of things. So when I say oversimplification, it's not just put more load on the bar, right? And from the overcomplication piece, it's not like it's just some specific exercise that's going to build this best or some specific machine, or to Steven's point, some specific supplement. There's basic things. If you're not building muscle, it's because you violated one of those very basic things. Period, end of story at the end of the day. And people want to get into a deeper conversation about what exactly everything looks like. No, let's just look at breaking it down to each one of these, what's the quality of the movement that you're using and how much tension are you actually applying to the area that you're trying to grow. Number two, how much load and what's the rep and set scheme that you're looking at there? Like, does it make sense? And again, we gave you some very principle or very basic, well-known kind of percentages and rep ranges to work within. And the last thing is, are you recovering well? And yes, that is a very deep rabbit hole, much deeper, I think, than the other two. But the recovery piece is that piece that probably people should be paying more attention to. And it's the piece that gets left off the table the most because it's not what happens in the gym. It's what happens outside the gym the other 23 or 22 and a half hours out of the day. So again, like we're at this point, we're at this point in the year where everybody's thinking, I gotta get fitter. What does that mean? I want to look better naked. I want to put on more muscle. I want to feel a little stronger. I want to have a little bit more energy, all those things. If you're focused on hypertrophy, you're probably going to get those by virtue of all the principles that go into getting that hypertrophy. Again, better quality movement, right? While you're there, not just showing up. You said intention, right? The loads that you're using are not you're not overdoing it. There's very little chance of you being overtrained. It's the last part. It's much more likely that you're under recovered, which comes from being under rested, undernourished, under macroed, right? In terms of the macro percentages that you have. So take a look at those things. If you're getting frustrated, or if you're in a position where you've hit this wall, or what people refer to as a plateau, it's likely that you're paying less attention to one of those principles, or more than one of those principles than you should be. They're pretty simple. They're pretty basic. There's a lot of really great workout programs out there that have kind of managed all the numbers for you in the first two things, right? The third thing is a little bit more is outside of those templates, if you will. So if you've got a template that you really like, it's probably not wrong. It's probably a pretty good program, right? In terms of building muscle. If you purchased it off the internet, or you got it on an app on your phone or whatever, if you got one of ours, it's probably pretty right on. It's that third thing that you probably need to be paying a little bit more attention to, and the things that go into that to make sure that you're getting, out of what you're putting into those other two principles.